National Health Service and in care homes who are looking after others, but also people who are keeping the food shops open, pharmacies, delivery drivers. These are all people who are contributing to our well-being, and they have a different kind of practice and a different kind of retreat, but it's an opportunity for them to practice in a very engaged way. And then, of course, we also have people who are experiencing grief, people who have lost loved ones over the past few weeks. And that can be a really difficult situation, and it takes time to get through that. But the practice can certainly help all of us, whatever our circumstances. When I first went on retreat at Plum Village, it was in the winter, and the only heating in Plum Village at that time was wood-burning stoves. And you know what they say about keeping warm by burning wood. You get warm by cutting the wood, and then by carrying the wood, and then you burn the wood. But it doesn't last very long, so you have to go back and start cutting more wood. And we had lots of that going on. And I can't smell wood smoke without kind of recalling those days, and that was a very happy memory. But on that retreat, Thich Nhat Hanh was actually giving the teachings, which were then written up as the book that became the heart of the Buddha's teachings. So he was talking about a wide range of the Buddhist teachings, and that was quite challenging in many ways, because I'd gone expecting it to be very quiet and peaceful, and here I was expected to kind of, you know, engage mentally with all this stuff. And it took a little while to get used to that and to accept that this wasn't going to be the sort of retreat that I had thought that it might be. So one of the things that Thich Nhat Hanh talked about on that retreat was what are sometimes known as the three concentrations, or the three samadhis in Pali. But Thai chose to talk about these as the three doors of liberation. And it was interesting on that retreat that I think we all experienced something of these doors of liberation. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about that this morning. So the three doors are aimlessness, signlessness, and emptiness. And I think we'll start off just by thinking about aimlessness. I certainly, at the start of the lockdown, I experienced a period of happiness associated with having an empty diary. You know, all the things that I had agreed to do, or the commitments that I had, suddenly got cancelled. And that was a great feeling of release and freedom, which I really appreciated. And it also freed me up just to kind of stop and enjoy where I was, and just to look around me. And it was amazing that I started to see things around my house and in my garden that I hadn't noticed before. I know I'm a keen naturalist, and one of the things that I've found over time is that if I go looking for a particular plant or a particular bird, I probably won't find it. But if I go with an open mind, I may or may not find that particular thing, but I may also, but I may find that the world contains many other wonderful things. And I think that was my initial experience of aimlessness in this retreat that we're all on now. Of course, that feeling of freedom doesn't last forever. After a little while, the old worries and anxieties come back in. And of course, we all have some anxiety about what's going to happen in the future. But of course, if we spend all our time worrying about the future, we won't actually be able to enjoy the present moment. In fact, the Buddha described anxiety as a hindrance. It's one of the things that blocks our practice and stops us being present in the moment. And that's something that I think we all have to work with. There's an American Dharma teacher called Rick Hanson who says that the human mind is Velcro for difficulties and Teflon for happiness. And this is a characteristic of the way our minds work. It's what makes us, as a species, very good problem solvers. But we easily get into the habit of anxiety and worry. And a retreat is a chance to let go of that and just to be present with whatever is. Of course, we have other ways in which we try and avoid anxiety and stress. And I think many of us are aware of retail therapy. And of course, consumption is one way that we try inappropriately to deal with anxiety. That might be consumption of food. I know when I'm stressed and anxious, I tend to eat too much. It may be that we try and consume other things. Some people consume alcohol or drugs in response to being stressed. And other people are looking for other forms of gratification in the form of fame or sex or power. And those are things which are external to ourselves. And what we're trying to do if we consume those things is actually to let go of our anxieties and to find happiness. But of course, the seed of happiness is already inside of us. And we don't actually have to look for anything external to water that seed. If we can allow our minds to become quiet and peaceful, then actually happiness emerges quite naturally. It's an emergent property of a quiet mind. And that's something that a retreat enables us to do. So this is a precious space for us to relax, engage with what's present in the moment, and experience the sensations of peace and happiness. And one of the things that I heard on the first retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, Thai, was that he said that if our practice is not capable of bringing us peace and joy, we're really not practicing. And that for me was a revelation, because I'd practiced in a different tradition before I came to the Plum Village tradition. And although it had given me a degree of quietness, I certainly couldn't say that it had brought me peace and joy. So I've stayed with that touchstone of practice being capable of giving me peace and joy. And that's been very important in my life since that time. And if we are present in the moment, we can see that actually we already have more than enough conditions to be peaceful and happy. I spoke recently to somebody in a local Sangha who is locked down with her children. And I started off by saying, well, you know, I'm sure this may be a difficult time for you because you've got the children wanting to be entertained and, you know, having, you know, that doesn't give you any time for yourself. And she said, no, you're quite wrong. She said, we're having a wonderful time. I'm really enjoying being with my children all the time. And they're really enjoying having me being fully present. And that experience of aimlessness, I think, is really helpful for me to remember that actually we all have the conditions that we need to be happy in the present moment if we approach them from in the right way. So that's aimlessness. The second of the doors of liberation is signlessness. And this is can be used, and certainly I did experience this on that first retreat, that I have a mind that likes to comment on things. And so I'm walking around, oh, look, there's a bird. Oh, it's a chaffinch. Or, that's a nice tree. Or it's an oak tree. So I tend to have this sort of commenting mind. And I found on that retreat that actually that commentary just died away. And that was really really wonderful, because actually it allowed me to really see those things rather than just label them and move on to the next thing. So I think signlessness can be really helpful in that way. I see at the moment when I'm out walking, I tend to meet other people. I live in a village, and so there are other people walking around. And it's quite interesting that one of the manifestations of signlessness is that we no longer label things as good or bad, people as friends or strangers. And it's been very interesting to see people walk, as I walk around, people who are complete strangers actually just stopping at a sensible, safe distance and having conversation with somebody they've never met before. And I've actually had some really lovely conversations with people over the last month, because I think people are more open, and you know, they're no longer thinking, oh, that's somebody I don't know, I have to just walk past. They're actually stopping and engaging. And that's a really wonderful aspect of this time for many of us. Of course, not everybody feels like that. There are some people who are feeling quite fearful. And when I'm out walking on a path, you know, you see people who, you know, are moving away so that they don't have to interact with you. And sometimes they, you know, they don't want to meet your eyes and they don't speak. They just walk past where they're looking straight ahead. And I have to respect that, you know, that actually that's something that reflects what's happening in their minds, that they're probably caught up in anxieties and that they are concerned that You know, if they get too close to anybody, they may get infected with coronavirus. So I have to respect that. I usually say good morning, but don't expect an answer. I don't have to have a reply, but just to let them know that I'm there. So signlessness, I think, has been a significant part of this retreat that we're all on. People are looking out for each other. I know my neighbours are looking out for me, and I'm looking out for my neighbours in a way that wasn't happening before. It's interesting too that the number of people who say that they think that the birds are singing louder now. And I don't know, there was an interesting program on the radio the other day where somebody had done a study on this. And in fact, they found that the birds are singing more quietly because they're not having to compete with the noise of traffic and people. But that actually the reason that we're really hearing the birds is that we are more present. We're really, hearing what's around us in a much more subtle way than we normally do. And that's a wonderful thing because we tend to go around, each of us goes around in our own little bubble in which we tend to think of ourselves as somehow unique and special. And that acts as a buffer that stops other people, other things getting close to us. And it was something that again, Thich Nhat Hanh talked about was that actually in the Diamond Sutra, the Diamond Sutra really has 4 messages to get across to us. The first is that as individuals, we are not special, we're not separate. The second one is that the human race is not special and not separate. And the third one is that living beings are not special and not separate. Living beings, of course, depend on the non-living world to be able to survive, as we all do. So we're not separate from the earth, from the rain, and the things that we regard as non-living. And the fourth thing that the Diamond Sutra is trying to get us to understand is that everything is impermanent and that everything is subject to change. And it's important, I think, that we recognize that as a species, we've tended to become very self-absorbed. We've become very self-absorbed as individuals. And we have stopped recognizing that we're part of an ecosystem that supports our life and the life of everything on the earth. And that actually we have to respect all aspects of that ecosystem. Because if one part fails, all of it will fail. And we have to be aware of that. And so this time on retreat is giving us the space and the tools to recognize those things. So when we find ourselves in difficult situations, if we are able to touch signlessness, we come to accept the situation. We're no longer labeling the situation as good or bad. And that enables us to let go of what we are not able to control and just accept things as they are. And that brings us great relief. There's a poem by a Chinese master which contains a line that I've always liked. He says, "When the opposites arise, the Buddha mind is lost." So when we start labeling things as good or bad, friend or stranger, then we've actually lost our capacity for being truly present in the moment, for being truly open to our Buddha nature. So the third of the doors of liberation is emptiness. And this is a term that has led to considerable confusion. When the British first encountered Buddhism in India, they came across this term emptiness, and they got completely the wrong idea about Buddhism from this, because it sounded as if it was a way of saying, well, nothing matters, it's nihilistic. And of course, that's what it's saying, is that actually the opposite of that. So when we talk about emptiness in Buddhism, what we're talking about is emptiness of a separate self. We're part of an ecosystem in which everything contains everything else. I am in you, and you are in me. So we have to recognize the significance of that in our everyday lives. And that's really what this teaching of emptiness is about. Thich Nhat Hanh often talks about a sheet of paper, and that if we are practicing well, then we can see in the sheet of paper, we can see the cloud that caused the rain to fall, that watered the tree, that the logger cut to go to the paper mill to produce the paper. And we can also see the sunshine and all the work that's got into producing the paper. And of course, we can see the earth, because that's where the tree came from. So everything contains everything else. And that's really at the heart of our practice. It used to be thought that adult human brains were not capable of change. That we became who we are during our childhood and our adolescence, and that thereafter our minds were fixed. And there's now a lot of evidence coming from neuroscience that that is not the case. Started back in the 1990s, people were doing brain scan studies of taxi drivers in London. And that taxi drivers have to learn what they call the knowledge, which is, they essentially have to commit the A to Z of London to memory. And it takes about 2 to 3 years. And what they did was to look at the brains of trainee taxi drivers before they started learning the knowledge, and then again afterwards. And what they found was that the areas of the brain that were responsible for memory became considerably enlarged during this time. And that was a real revelation to the scientists who were involved. And so they've gone on and looked at other aspects of our experience that influence the way our brain is. And it's been shown that mindfulness practice also has profound effects on our brain. That if we are mindful over a period of time, what will happen will be that the areas of the brain that are responsible for making connections between different parts of our brain become more active, and that enables us to see the connections between things, to see the connection between the cloud and the paper, between the earth and the tree. And so this is as I say, this idea that the human brain can change is not new to Buddhists. We've known this for 2,500 years. But science is slowly catching up. And I say that as a scientist. So a friend of mine said something to me which really had, I think I'm still trying to process. She's a practitioner in a different tradition. And what she said was that enlightenment is a true realization of emptiness, a true understanding of emptiness. And I think that's very much at the heart of our practice. If I look deeply, I can see that even though I live by myself, I'm supported by the earth, which provides me with food and with shelter. And I'm supported by many people and the many things that I need to live. So the insight of into being is part of the insight of emptiness. And the insight of into being helps me to see that even though I live by myself, I'm not alone. The other part of the insight of emptiness is the insight of impermanence, that everything is in the process of change. And that, of course, includes me. And it was wonderful to hear Thich Nhat Hanh talk about this. Somebody asked him, Thai, what happens when we die? It was one of the children. They always ask the best questions. And Thai said, well, Buddhism teaches us that when something or someone dies, nothing is lost. That our bodies go back to the earth, to the air, to the water. The energy is released. But that our consciousness continues in everything and everyone that we've ever had contact with. Now I don't have children, so I don't have any descendants, but I can see that my students are my descendants, and that after I have passed away, my elements of my consciousness will still be present in my students in the university and present in everybody that I've ever met or talked with. And that I have found to be really liberating. So we continue to be inspired and affected by those who have died. As of course, we're also inspired by those who care for those who have coronavirus. And this sense of impermanence, but that we're all connected. I don't know if you're familiar with the poem by the 17th century poet John Donne, who said, and I will abbreviate it, he said, "No man is an island, but part of a continent, never sent to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee." And so, although many of us are in an environment where we are safe and maybe we're not very affected by the coronavirus, we are connected to those who are, and we can support them by remembering those people in our meditation and being with them in their time of need. So emptiness is a wonderful teaching. It helps us to see that we also need to take care of those who are in poor countries who don't have the facilities to take care of themselves, particularly at this difficult time. And they don't have adequate health care, let alone respirators and intensive care units. And if we support those people, that helps also to support ourselves. Because if we support them and help them to control the pandemic, it will stop it coming back to us as another wave. And I'm really happy to see that the British government have recognised this and that they've given £1 billion to the United Nations to help to support these countries through this time. We've also had other positive outcomes of the coronavirus pandemic. The government have moved to help homeless people to have somewhere to live. That's a really good thing. And of course, that's an ongoing thing because there are now a lot of unemployed people who may not be able to afford anywhere to live. So that's going to be an ongoing process. We have to recognize that that's going to continue. Another positive consequence of coronavirus, of course, has been reduced travel, and that's meant less pollution and less noise and less in the way of carbon dioxide emissions. And we've already seen how the earth is beginning to renew itself. The bird song, the animals coming into towns and villages which wouldn't normally do that. This is only a small step along the way. We've still got a long way to go in terms of helping the earth, but it's a step in the right direction. If we look deeply, we can see that this pandemic is not just the result of an animal virus spreading to humans. It's also the result of globalization. Because we travel so much, the disease has spread very rapidly. Because we rely on buying essential supplies from poor countries where they can produce cheaply, we are no longer producing them for ourselves. And so we have a crisis about personal protective equipment because we've stopped producing it in this country. So there's a whole lot of consequences that come from this that I think are going to make a great deal of difference in the future to the way that we look at the world. We have to become more self-sufficient as individuals and as a country. And our economy has to stop constantly trying to sell things to everybody and find a more sustainable model. The world won't be the same after the coronavirus pandemic. There'll be lots of unforeseen changes. And that's a good thing, because actually the world we were living in was not sustainable, and we need to change the way that we operate. And so the pandemic has been the bell of mindfulness that we need. And we're all going to have a role in making sure that the lessons are not lost, that we don't go back to business as normal when the lockdown ends. Somebody said that we don't want to go back to normal. Normal is what got us into this mess. And I think there's a lot in that. So we're going to need to take better care of ourselves as individuals and as a society in the future. And I think what Thich Nhat Hanh said about peace and happiness is going to be really important in the way that we continue to live our lives. That if we can take that forward, then the world will be a different place. Thank you very much.